Hello, welcome to another video of Code Snippet. In this video, we are going to talk about AWS CLI. It is basically a command line interface provided by AWS, and it is very helpful tool in order to perform heavy operations on your AWS. Now we are going to understand it and make use of it in this particular video. So let's get started without wasting any time. This is going to be a fun video, so sit back, relax and enjoy the show. Alright, so let's quickly jump into the agenda of this particular video. So AWS CLI. That is command line interface. So first we will understand what exactly is AWS CLI. After that we will see how to install AWS CLI on your machine. So your local machine, basically local computer. After that we will see how we can configure AWS CLI. And at the end we will see how we can use it. So that is basically the simple agenda of this particular video. So let's get started. So until now what we did in order to create AWS services, we went to this particular AWS console, right? We have searched whatever service we wanted. For example, let's say AWS S3. Let's say if I want to create a bucket, I went to this particular S3 and here I got option to create a bucket and I have created this kind of buckets, right? It was pretty simple and it is very good to see on the UI and stuff, right? Very simple stuff. But now let's think realistically, right? Now let's say you have to create an entire application and you have to create a lot of services. Now you need to go one by one and create it inside this particular AWS console. It is going to be a time consuming and manual process. After that, let's say you have multiple environments as well. Let's say you have dev environment, stage environment, prod environment, right? So you need to go and create all these components. Let's say for example, S3 bucket on each of your environment, right? So it is going to be a tedious process. Or let's say I have this S3 bucket. Now this S3 bucket have a lot of data, right? Let's say this bucket have 1000 files. And I want to download all 1000 files. Then there will not be any option like select all and download over here. What you need to do, you need to download them one by one. Well, now is that a feasible approach? No, it is not. So in such use cases as well, AWS CLI will come in handy and you can easily perform this task by using a single command through AWS CLI. That is basically the use case of your AWS CLI. Now, if I go back to Canvas, now this is what we have discussed just now, right? Today, how do we do operation? We go to our AWS CLI over here and we perform all these operations like creating S3 bucket, Lambda functions, IAM. So as a user, what I do, I log into this particular AWS console and perform the operations. But as we have discussed, it is not a feasible approach. So what is the solution? AWS came up with the solution called as AWS CLI, that is AWS Command Line Interface. Now, if you see, AWS CLI is a unified tool to manage your AWS services. With just one tool to download and configure, you can control multiple AWS services from command line and you can also automate them through a scripts. So you can write few shell script and automate them as well. You just need to go ahead and run the script and it will create all the stuff for you. So that is basically your AWS CLI. Now, if I scroll down over here, so now instead of your user directly interacting to AWS console, we have AWS CLI in between. So your user will interact with AWS CLI by using commands and this particular CLI will send the respective commands to this particular AWS console and perform the respective operation based on the command provided. So what this guy is going to do, this guy will simply send the HTTP request to your AWS and get the respective operation done. So that is basically the simple stuff and this is basically something which we are going to look into this particular video. So that is basically your AWS CLI and that is basically your basic use case over here. And now what you need to do, we need to download and configure it first, right? So this is basically important stuff. We need to download and configure. So let me just click on get started over here. If you see over here, we have getting started with AWS CLI. Now, if you see over here to access AWS services with AWS CLI, you need what you need? You need at minimum an AWS account and IAM credentials. Well, that is straightforward thing, right? If you don't have AWS account, where actually you are going to interact, right? So that is basically something we are going to need, and IAM credentials also we need. So we will come back to it later after we install it, right? After that, here we have install and gain access to AWS CLI using following methods. So now we will go to this recommended method. Let's say installing or updating the latest version of AWS CLI. If I scroll down over here, then you have multiple OS support. If you have Linux, you can just hit this particular commands and follow these steps. You will be able to install it. After that, if you have Windows is even easier. You just need to download this particular CLI. So if I click on it, it will start a download. See this particular AWS CLI v2. Now you just need to run this inside your AWS machine. Very, very simple stuff, right? So it is basically MSI installer for Windows. You just need to run it and it will just start on your machine. Simple stuff. And for Mac OS also we have couple of commands. So if you see over here, we have the GUI installer and we have command line installer as well. What I'll do, I'll go with command line installer. What I will do, I will first download. So we need to copy this command. So I'll just go over here, open my terminal. Let me bring it up over here and let me just paste the command. Let's see what happens. So it is basically downloading the stuff for me. Now once it is downloaded, what we need to do, we need to hit another command. Let me just hit that. Let me just put on the password. It is basically installing. So there we go. The install was successful, right? So the install was successful. Now what I can do, I can just go ahead and try to hit this particular command, say which AWS, an AWS version basically. So I got this particular response saying this is basically the location of my AWS and this is basically the version of my AWS CLI 2.28.18, right? So simple stuff over here. And we are expecting the same output. That means it is successfully installed on our machine. So we have seen how to install it now, right? So if I go back over here, we have seen what is AWS CLI and how to install. Pretty simple stuff, right? After that, let's see how we can configure AWS CLI. If I go back over here now I have installed this particular CLI on my machine. Now I want to perform operations on AWS, but at least I should have an account, which I have over here, right? This is basically my account ID, no problem. But now how your CLI is going to know which account to connect to? What permissions AWS CLI have? Once we hit this command, is it really authorized to perform operation on certain AWS account? Does it have authority to, let's say, create S3 bucket? How it is going to define all these things? Well, it is going to define it by using configure. So we need to configure our AWS CLI to connect to our respective account. Now, if you remember, this is something which we have seen already, right? We have seen this already in our previous videos. So this is basically when we connected to S3 from our local. This is basically when we connected to DynamoDB from our local. What we made use of? We made use of AWS SDK and S3 client or DynamoDB client. Now we were able to connect to S3 bucket and AWS Dynamo from our local, right? And how did we do that? We did it by using a user. We created a user, we created a IAM user, and what we did, we created client ID, secret ID and region. And we have provided the access or permissions to access S3 and permissions to access DynamoDB to this particular user. And client ID, secret ID and region we provided inside our application, which we created by using this particular user, right? If I go back over here and if I go to IAM, identity and access management, and if I go to users, so we don't really have any user over here. What we need to do, we need to create a user now. So this user, we need to create, provide these permissions, generate your client ID and secret ID, and provide that secret ID and client ID to your AWS CLI. So in a similar way, we are going to do this as well. It is pretty similar stuff. So what we are going to do, we are going to create a user. So again, what we need to do, we need to create a user inside AWS, provide the respective permissions to this particular user. After that, once we have user, we need to generate client ID and secret ID for this particular user and provide this particular client ID and secret ID to the AWS CLI configuration, which will be used by AWS CLI to connect to this particular AWS account and perform the operations for which they have permissions. So that is basically your AWS configure. And now let's see how we can do that, right? It is pretty simple stuff. And we can do that by using a simple command, which is AWS configure, right? So if I click on it, now it is asking me your access key. Now if you see, it is asking me AWS access key. Let me press enter. After that, it is asking me AWS secret key, right? Secret access key. After that, it is asking me default region, right? So all these things we need to provide, and default output format also it is asking, right? So all these things we need to provide. For now, I just skipped it because we don't have that yet, right? So how we can generate that? So let's go back over here. Let's go back to user and let's try to create a user now. And here I will say username as Chetan, right? And I will just say next. And I will just add it to developer group so that all the access present inside this particular group will be given to this particular user, right? And I'll just say next. Let's try to create it. So we have this particular user, it is being created. If I go inside it, now you will see that we have this particular permissions, because these permissions are coming from these groups, right? So I have this developer group. I've just given this group over here. If you are not aware what is the group, what is the user, what is the role, you can go ahead and check out IAM video. I have covered everything over there. Now here, if you see, we have create access key. So I can just go ahead and create. Now it is asking me for use cases. You plan to use access key to enable AWS CLI. Now last time we used it in S3 or DynamoDB video, we made use of local code. Now I'll say command line interface, because we are going to use it in CLI. And I'll just say I understand, and I'll just say next. I'll just give a tag over here saying CLI, and let's say create. Now we have this access key, and now we have this secret key. Now this is basically a confidential thing, because anyone can make use of this secret key and access key and connect to your AWS account, right? So be aware you are not sharing it or you are not displaying it anywhere, right? So now what I'll do, I'll just copy this. I'll go back over here. Now it is basically access key, right? Not client ID, access key and secret key we need, right? Now what I'll do, I'll just again say AWS configure, AWS access key. I'll give this one, right? Which I have just copied, and I'll press enter. After that we need access key. I'll go back over here. I'll say show. I'll copy it. Now I am showing it over here because I am going to delete it after this particular video. Make sure you are not sharing it anywhere, right? Because anyone can use it. So now I'll say enter. After that, default region name. So we usually make use of Asia Pacific region, right? So what I will do, I'll go to AWS and I'll go ahead over here and I'll just copy this AP-South-1, right? I'll just paste it over here. Default output format, I'll just keep default for now. Now if you see, AWS configuration is completed, right? Now what I'll do, in order to check if it is working, I can make use of this AWS help, right? Or we can just say AWS service name and help. What I'll do, AWS help. So we are getting all these things, help related stuff, right? The AWS Command Line Interface is unified tool to manage your AWS, blah, 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 right? Now what I'll do, I'll say AWS S3 help, right? S3 help, so that it will tell us how we can perform operations on S3. So name S3, right? So what I'll do, I'll just minimize this a bit so that it's visible. Now if you see over here in the description, it is telling us how we can perform operations on S3, right? Now if you see, it has a lot of stuff over here, right? Now if you see over here, we have these available commands in which we have this particular ls is one of the command, right? Ls means list your S3. So what I'll do, I'll just say AWS S3 and ls, right? So let's try that if that works. I'll say Control Z, I'll say AWS S3 ls. And now if you see over here, we are getting one bucket name. That means we have this one bucket present over here, which is basically our AWS code snippet v1, right? Simple stuff. AWS S3 ls. I did only ls and we got this particular bucket name. That means our connection to the AWS through our AWS CLI is successful by using this user, and we are able to retrieve our bucket name, right? Now let's go back to help and let's see what else we can do. What else do we have over here? So we also have MB, that is make bucket, if I'm not wrong. So let's try to create a bucket now. Now if you see over here at the top, it says something called as S3 URI. This is basically how you provide your bucket name, right? Now what I'll do, let's try to create a bucket. So what I'll do, I'll say AWS. So I'll say AWS S3 MB, that is make bucket. After that, I'll say S3 : / I will give a bucket name. Let's say code snippet v2. And that's it. Let's try to hit it. And guess what? It is saying that the requested bucket name is not available. I guess this name is already taken. So let's try to change a name. Let's say v3. Again, it is not available. So what I'll do, I'll say v1 only and add a hyphen over here. There we go. So our new bucket is basically created. Now if I say AWS S3 ls, there we go. Then we should get two buckets, basically the one which we have just created, right? So like that, we can create bucket as well. Now if I go back to AWS S3 help again, then you will see what other operations we have. We have seen ls, we have seen make bucket. RB should be remove bucket, so it will delete bucket for us, I'm assuming. After that, looks like CP is basically copy file. So let's try to copy a file. What I'll do, let me just clear all of this first. Now let's try to create a file at local, and we can do that by using, let's say, touch, and let's say file name dot txt. So let's try to upload a text file. So this file should be created over here. There we go, it is created. Now what we can do, we can just go to our last command and let's say cp over here. Let's say file name dot txt, file name dot txt, and our bucket name, right? So let's hit enter. Now upload of your file name txt is successful. So now if I list the buckets, and now what I can do, let's try to list the content inside bucket. So I'll just say S3 : the name of our bucket, let's say code snippet -v1, and I'll just give an extra slash. That means whatever is present inside this particular bucket, list it. So now if I hit enter, you will see that a file name is present inside this particular bucket. Now if I go back over here and if I go to S3, let's see if that bucket is present over here. If you see over here, this bucket is present, and inside this bucket we have this file name .text, which do not really contain anything, right? Because we did not add anything over there. And after that we can simply remove bucket as well, isn't it? We have RB. If I remember correctly, RB should remove our bucket. So it says error occurred, bucket is not empty, so bucket should be empty. In order to delete that, what we need to do, we need to delete stuff inside bucket. So now what I'll do, I'll just say file name .txt, and in order to remove your files from your S3, you have something called as rm. So I'll just say enter, and it has deleted our file basically, no problem. Now I'll try to remove the bucket. So bucket is now removed. Now if I say AWS S3 ls, you will see that we only have one bucket, right? We don't have any other bucket basically. So that is how it basically works. And you can do this for any AWS service. So if I say AWS Lambda and I'll say help, then you will see that name is Lambda, and you will get help document for Lambda as well. So for Lambda, you have all these particular methods. We have list functions basically. So let's try that probably. What I'll do, I'll say AWS Lambda and I'll say list functions, right? If I hit enter, you will see that we don't have any function present basically. Otherwise we would be getting that particular name, right? And that is how you can simply perform operations on your AWS from your CLI, right? Pretty simple stuff basically. So now here we are just running a simple command, right? It's pretty simple command, straightforward thing. It looks like instead of learning all these commands, we can go ahead and do operations on UI instead. Well, that is not the case. For example, let's say we have removed this file, right? Now let's say we have 1000 files inside AWS S3. So what we can do, we can just run this recursively, saying -- recursive, and delete all the files. Or let's say you can copy all the files, download all the files, right? That is basically the use case that you have, and which is very, very important. You cannot go ahead and do that manually over there, right? It's not actually feasible. So that is when AWS CLI is something which comes in handy, right? And in future videos, we will make use of AWS CLI wherever required, right? So we will be making use of both AWS CLI and AWS console as well. Now, another important aspect over here is making use of scripts. So you can have automated scripts, let's say bash scripts or shell scripts, right? Or PowerShell scripts in Windows, right? Which you can create and run and perform operations over here. We just need to run that script and it will just perform operations for you. What I'll do, I'll just simply create a script. Let's say touch, I'll say auto script, and let's create a shell script, right? And let me just try to modify that now. So it does not really have anything. What I'll do, I'll just open a VI editor. I'll say auto, and let's try to insert. And what I will do, I'll just paste it. So if you see, it is a basic shell script where we have defined this bucket name, my demo bucket. After that, I'm echoing that I'm creating this bucket. Then we'll just create this bucket. After that, we will upload a simple file to this particular bucket. After that, we will just list it, right? So it is a simple script basically. I'll just save it. And if I try to display the content, you will see that the file is basically present, right? Now I will just go ahead and run this script. So I'll say ./autoscript.sh. Let's enter. It says permission denied. So we need to first change the permission by using chmod -x, and I'll say autoscript.sh. So that should change the permission of it. Now let's try to run it. It again says permission denied. It should be plus, not minus. Now let's try to run it. So if you see, it is creating bucket now, and it failed. It failed because it is saying the requested bucket name is not available, right? So again, bucket name issue is coming. So what I'll do, I'll go ahead and let's try to update the bucket name over here. I will go over here and let's try to change the bucket name, and let's say code snippet -v2 now, and hoping that it should be present. WQ, it should save it. Let me see if the changes are done. If you see over here, the name is updated. Now what I'll do, I'll quickly try to run the command again. Now it is trying to create S3 bucket. So now the bucket is created, and guess what? hello.txt does not really exist, right? What I will do, I'll just create that file .txt, and let's try to run this script again. Now if you see, the file is basically uploaded the file. After that, we are listing the file, and you will see that the file name is basically present over here. So that is how you can just create a shell script and run it by using AWS CLI. It is pretty simple stuff. So whatever operation you want to do, just write a script and it will just run it for you, right? You don't really need to do much over here. Just write a script single time. You can execute it multiple times basically. So that is basically how you can make use of this particular AWS CLI in order to automate your stuff. So now if I go back over here, we have seen how to configure, and we have also seen how to use AWS CLI, and we have also seen how to write scripts and run the shell scripts on your AWS CLI to perform your operations, right? Now at the end, what I will do, as I mentioned in the beginning, I'll go to this IAM, I'll go to users, and I will just go ahead and delete this particular user now. I'll just deactivate this access key first, and I will delete this user. Now it is deleting our user, and it should be deleted now. So it is deleted basically. Now if I go back and let's try to do some operation again, let's say AWS S3 ls, then it won't be able to do because the access key ID provided does not exist in our records, it is saying, right? The access ID that I have shared over here is no longer useful, right? So I have deleted it basically. So always keep your access key and secret key private. Don't share it with anyone, right? Otherwise anyone can connect to your AWS account basically. That is basically AWS CLI. So we have seen all these things, pretty simple stuff. Now your AWS CLI is just starting, right? It is pretty simple stuff, basic scripts you can create. Now we want to gradually move to infrastructure as a code. Infrastructure code by using tools such as Terraform or cloudformation, by using which you can handle entire infrastructure of your application by using a code. By using your pipelines, you can easily deploy that. So it is going to be fun again. So that is basically the end goal that we want to achieve. And that is why I have started with AWS CLI, because we cannot really go and do the job on AWS console every time, right? And it's not a feasible approach. It is good to learn, but it is not something which you can do frequently. That is why something like this should be helpful, and something like Terraform is very easy and very helpful stuff. And it is heavily being used inside industry applications. So that is something we will see in the future. So that's it for this particular AWS CLI video. If you like the video, hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to Code Snippet. If you want to learn exciting stuff in future like Terraform, CloudFormation, infrastructure as a code, then don't forget to subscribe. Go ahead and hit that red button right now. Your little effort of subscribing will give me more enthusiasm to create more such videos. Share this video with your friends so that they also have idea about AWS CLI. That's it for this video. See you in the next video.